After we sent Reno's troops charging into that big Indian village, I remember Custer coming within about 300 or 400 yards of the river before he turned off to the right. The ford where Reno crossed had a high bank, and the trail split around a little rise where some of the Rees were sitting, holding a council and figuring out how many Sioux were down there across the river. One of them was picking up handfuls of grass, dropping it, and pointing toward the Sioux, who we could see down and across the river, showing they were thick as the grass. I went to the left of that knoll and down to the river through a dry ravine. The woods and fallen logs on the opposite side made us go more slowly. About halfway down to where the skirmish line was formed, I spotted Custer and his whole command up on the bluffs across the river, over to the east, near where Reno later built defenses, maybe a little south of there. Custer's bunch was moving at a trot. We were on the skirmish line, and there wasn't much fierce fighting going on. I doubt many of our shots found their mark. We couldn't hold that line for more than 20 minutes. The men were in good spirits, chatting and laughing, not thinking we'd be beaten. The Sioux were over by their village, riding around, kicking up dust, but mostly staying out of our reach. Then we spotted the Sioux circling around our left flank, stretching out toward the hills to the west. We scrambled to our horses and took cover behind that little rise between the trees and the open plain. From there, we aimed and fired at the Indians for a while. Lieutenant Hare even borrowed a rifle from Lieutenant Wallace to try his luck shooting at the Indians as they rode in circles. Around that time, someone yelled that the Indians were approaching the horses on our left flank. McIntosh and I, along with the rest of the troop, hurried over to investigate. With the river behind us, we found no Indians in that direction. Reno appeared composed in the timber. Returning, we realized the situation had escalated with intense firing ahead, and our comrades were urging us to move quickly as the Indians closed in. Captain Moylan gave Troop A the order to mount up after about 10 minutes. "Where are you going, Moylan?" Hodgson inquired. Moylan responded that he intended to charge. Lieutenant Varnum objected, urging, "For God's sake, men, let's stay put. There's enough of us here to face the entire Sioux Nation." Despite Varnum's plea, the stampede commenced and couldn't be stopped. As I mounted my horse, it was shot out from under me. Spotting an unmounted horse nearby, I quickly jumped on, but Trooper Martin came up and laid claim to the horse. I reluctantly surrendered it to Martin, who tragically met his end during the retreat. Along with a few comrades, I proceeded on foot behind the retreating column. Indians on horseback were attacking from the right flank, and soon I realized they were also closing in from behind. Swiftly, I decided to fall back toward the timber, encountering pursuing Indians along the way. Whenever they approached too closely, I aimed and fired, forcing them to retreat. This strategy kept me safe until I reached the timber, though one bold Indian managed to ride up dangerously close from behind. In a split second, I turned and fired my carbine, bringing him down. Sadly, one of our dismounted soldiers didn't make it to safety and was killed. Once inside the timber on the south side, I spotted Lieutenant Charles DeRudio and joined forces with him. On my return journey, I passed McIntosh, who was mounted on McCormick's horse, and asked about the command's whereabouts. Further along, I came across Rapp, the last man out, leading McIntosh's horse. Just before the Indians got up to Rapp and killed him, Rapp asked about Tosh. The horses of Scouts Billy Jackson, perhaps Bob, and Gerard were tied apart. DeRudio had lost his horse, and together with Jackson, we took cover in a buffalo wallow. From there, we watched as Indians moved about in the open, preparing ourselves for a potential confrontation, but they eventually passed by without incident. Gerard's horse began to whinny, prompting Jackson to quickly stuff a handful of grass into its mouth and tie it securely to keep it quiet. With Indians all around us, we moved cautiously, not daring to venture far until nightfall. Throughout the afternoon, gunfire echoed from Custer's direction, including 3 distinct volleys. I believe the shooting continued until around 5 p.m., as best as I can recall. Around 10 p.m., the 4 of us and our 2 horses cautiously emerged from the timber and started up the riverbank, with DeRudio and me grasping the horses' tails. Soon, we came upon fallen men and recognized Lieutenant McIntosh in the faint moonlight. Shortly after, we encountered a small group of mounted Sioux who turned and avoided us. We had heard the gunfire aimed at Reno throughout the afternoon and evening, but once night fell and all was quiet, we weren't certain whether the command had been decimated on the bluff or had managed to withdraw. Assessing the steep bluffs on the east side, we concluded they were too difficult to scale, deciding it was best to head back towards Ford A. As we proceeded up the river, I asked Gerard to test the water's depth by riding his horse into it, but he refused. So I waded in myself and unexpectedly found a hole that went up to my neck. I pulled myself out of the water, and we proceeded farther up the river. After drinking water, we all crossed to the island. Unexpectedly, at the north end, we came upon a dozen or so Sioux-speaking Indians shouting from their ponies. Gerard and Jackson swiftly turned their horses, heading back north along our previous path and disappearing from view. The Indians, startled, mounted their horses and swiftly rode into the river, keeping a distance of about 15 yards from us. DeRudio fell behind and I crouched down, drawing my pistol, prepared for any danger. I heard footsteps approaching, and upon seeing the cap, I recognized DeRudio. He exclaimed, "O'Neill, they're all gone." We wandered around the island looking for a place to cross the main stream, but fatigue overcame us and we sat down to rest. I took off my clothing and wrung them out. My clothes were completely drenched and my boots were full of water. Suddenly, we were startled by the sounds of hooves and voices. We waded toward the island only to discover deep water on its east side. We heard voices on the river's east bank just as the first rays of dawn appeared. "Tom Custer!" DeRudio yelled as he dashed outside. "Tom Custer!" They weren't an army, they were Sioux, and I knew well then to underestimate them. The Sioux wasted no time and began firing at us, forcing us to scramble back through the thickets on the island toward a cluster of bushes. To our dismay, we stumbled upon 7 or 8 mounted Indians. Realizing we were spotted, I fired my carbine into their midst, while DeRudio fired his revolver. The scene erupted into chaos. The Indians' ponies panicked and collided, creating a momentary distraction that allowed us to flee. We rushed eastward for about 150 yards till we reached the river's main bank. There we found temporary shelter among trees washed up against stumps, forming a triangular refuge. However, the Indians pursued us relentlessly, firing about 50 shots into our hiding place, with bullets striking the logs all around us. The gravity of our situation sank in. With a sense of resignation, I unbuckled my cartridge belt, still holding about 25 carbine rounds and 12 revolver shots. It felt inevitable that this standoff would be our last. DeRudio and I exchanged a solemn handshake, mentally preparing ourselves for what we believed could be our final moments. Fortunately, the Sioux didn't pursue us, probably thinking we had managed to slip away. We spent the entire day laying low, listening to the skirmish between Reno's men on the bluff and the gunfire from Benteen echoing just above us. Some Indians were positioned between us and Benteen, their voices carrying clearly across the landscape. I felt as though I had lived my longest day ever. Eager to get going, we awaited dusk with trepidation. Finally, darkness fell, and we set out up the river, aiming to cross at Ford A and return to the Rosebud Trail. Hunger gnawed at us. We had barely eaten 3 pieces of hardtack since the morning of the 25th. My mouth was so dry from thirst that I couldn't even produce saliva. The hardtack was as dry as flour, impossible to swallow without spitting it out. When we reached the water, we drank deeply, feeling a wave of relief wash over us. We must have missed the ford and passed it, but we waded across, heading towards the deserted village near the burning teepee. There, we hoped to find some dried meat or overlooked bones left by the Sioux 2 days earlier. As we trudged up Benteen Creek about a mile from the river, I heard a mule braying in the distance to my left. I pushed DeRudio a little and inquired if he had heard it as well. DeRudio, who was hard of hearing, hadn't picked up on anything, but I was convinced the command might be nearby. With determination, we headed in that direction. Eventually, we heard voices, though they were too far off to tell if they were speaking English or Sioux. Eager to find out, we moved stealthily forward, stopping to listen and then creeping closer. At last, a well-known voice, that of Sergeant McVeigh from Troop A, yelled, "Hello, Mac." Several voices responded with, "Who's there?" "Lieutenant DeRudio and Tom O'Neill," McVeigh retorted. Now that he was certain, DeRudio moved ahead of me and approached the command more quickly than I did. On June 28th, I assisted with the funeral rites. I personally excavated the grave where General Custer was buried with Hammond. Lieutenant Wallace wrapped a piece of paper bearing the general's name, placed it next to a small stake by Custer's head, and slipped it into an empty cartridge shell. Before he was buried, Dr. Porter took locks of hair from all the officers. His description of General Custer's wounds closely matched Hammond's account: shot through the head behind both temples and through the chest. Tom Custer, identifiable by his face, had suffered disembowelment, but his chest remained intact.